February 14, 1945, 11:30 hours. Camp Clinton, Mississippi. The air is thick with a humidity Gefreiter Carl Schmidt had only ever read about in adventure novels. It clings to his wool uniform, a garment made for the frozen mud of the Ardennes, not the damp warmth of the American Deep South. He watches a guard, a young man no older than himself, lazily toss a baseball with another soldier. Their laughter carries on the breeze, a sound so alien, so profoundly out of place. It makes the back of his neck prickle. In his pocket, his fingers trace the worn edges of a photograph of his wife, Lena. The last letter he received, now nearly 3 months old, spoke of dwindling rations and the constant, droning fear of Allied bombers over Stuttgart. He had been captured near St. Vith, concussed and half-frozen in a snow-filled ditch, convinced his war was over in the worst possible way. The propaganda films had been very clear. Capture by the Americans meant starvation, torture, and a shallow, unmarked grave. Yet, here he stands. His stomach is full from a breakfast of eggs, white bread, and something they called grits. He is not beaten. He is not interrogated beyond basic questions. In the barracks, men are organizing a soccer league. Others are signing up for university-level courses in agriculture and engineering, taught by fellow prisoners who were professors in their former lives. Carl looks from the laughing guards to the neat rows of barracks, to the men walking freely to the mess hall. He thinks of Lena, huddled in a freezing cellar, and a disorienting, almost shameful thought surfaces. This place of captivity, this symbol of his total defeat, feels more peaceful and secure than the home he fought so desperately to defend. The reality of his situation is so profoundly different from his expectation that it feels like a dream. A strange, confusing, and unsettlingly pleasant dream. This wasn't a prison camp. It was a paradox. To understand the surreal experience of men like Carl Schmidt, one must look beyond the battlefield to a largely unseen element of Allied grand strategy, the prisoner of war program. By 1945, the United States was holding over 425,000 enemy prisoners on its own soil, the vast majority of them German. This massive undertaking was not an afterthought. It was a calculated policy rooted in pragmatism, international law, and psychological warfare. The foundational document governing this entire system was the 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war. Unlike Nazi Germany, which applied the convention selectively, or the Soviet Union, which had not ratified it at all, the United States committed to upholding its articles to the letter. This was not born solely of altruism. There was a powerful strategic incentive: reciprocity. American leaders knew that hundreds of thousands of their own soldiers were in German hands. Any mistreatment of German POWs in America could be used as a pretext for brutal retaliation against Allied prisoners in camps like Stalag Luft III or Oflag 4C. Adherence to the convention was a shield for their own men. The program was managed by the Provost Marshal General's Office, a branch of the U.S. Army. They established a sprawling network of over 500 camps across 46 states. The locations were chosen for specific reasons. Many were in the South and Southwest, like Camp Clinton in Mississippi or Camp Hearn in Texas, where the mild climate reduced the cost of winterizing facilities and the rural settings offered a degree of isolation. These were not hastily constructed barbed-wire pens. Often, they were built to the same specifications as training facilities for American soldiers, featuring sturdy wooden barracks, dedicated mess halls, infirmaries, and recreational fields. The logic was simple: a well-fed, healthy and occupied prisoner was a manageable prisoner. The U.S. War Department calculated that the cost of preventing riots, escapes, and disease through decent treatment was far lower than the cost of suppressing them. The daily caloric intake for a German POW was set to be roughly equivalent to that of a U.S. soldier in a non-combat role, around 2,700 to 3,000 calories. This was a staggering amount of food to men who had been subsisting on black bread and thin soup on the collapsing fronts in Europe. Furthermore, the program had an economic dimension. With millions of American men serving overseas, the country faced a severe labor shortage, particularly in agriculture and industry. Under the rules of the Geneva Convention, enlisted prisoners could be put to work in non-war-related industries. Officers were exempt, but many volunteered. Prisoners picked cotton in Mississippi, harvested sugar beets in Colorado, cut timber in Wisconsin, and worked in canning factories in the Midwest. They were paid for their labor in camp scrip at a rate of 80 cents per day, which they could spend at the camp canteen or PX on items like Coca-Cola, cigarettes, candy, and toiletries, small luxuries that felt like immense riches. This entire apparatus, legal, logistical, and economic, was designed for efficiency and control. But it would have a profound, unintended psychological consequence. For the German Lanzer, scooped up from the hellscape of the Eastern Front or the brutal attrition of Normandy, arriving in America was not just a journey across an ocean. It was a journey into an alternate reality. To grasp the depth of the shock, one must first inhabit the mind of the average German soldier in late 1944 and 1945. His world was one of shrinking perimeters and expanding fear. For years he had been conditioned by the pervasive propaganda of Joseph Goebbels. This propaganda painted a monolithic image of the enemy. The Soviets were portrayed as subhuman Bolshevik hordes who would inflict unimaginable atrocities. The Americans were depicted as a decadent, racially mixed, and cowardly society. But their soldiers, the propaganda warned, were gangsters and criminals who would be merciless to captives. The reality of combat had already shattered many illusions. On the Eastern Front, the fighting was a primal struggle for survival. Quarter was neither asked for nor given. Capture by the Red Army was widely considered a death sentence, and for good reason. Of the 91,000 Germans who surrendered at Stalingrad, only 5,000 ever returned home. The war in the West, while less ideologically savage, was still terrifyingly lethal. A soldier huddled in a foxhole in the Hürtgen forest or a pillbox on the Siegfried Line knew only the visceral reality of American industrial might. The endless artillery barrages they called time on target, the swarms of P-47 Thunderbolts that hunted anything that moved, and the seemingly infinite waves of Sherman tanks and well-fed GIs. His physical condition was often abysmal. Rations were inconsistent and poor quality. His uniform was worn, his boots leaked, and the gnawing cold of the European winter was a constant companion. He was likely exhausted, suffering from malnutrition, and psychologically scarred by years of brutal conflict. The concept of surrender was fraught with terror. He had seen what happened to his comrades who were captured in the heat of battle. He had been told that surrender to the Americans meant being shot on the spot or shipped to a brutal camp to be worked to death. The moment of capture was therefore a moment of supreme crisis. It was the absolute Nadhazovo. Throwing down his Mauser rifle, hands raised in the air, he was not expecting mercy. He was expecting the end. The first surprise was often the American GI himself. Instead of the bloodthirsty gangster from the newsreels, he was often met by a young, weary soldier from Ohio or California who was just as tired of the war as he was. The prisoner would be searched, disarmed, and given a cigarette or a K-ration chocolate bar. This small act of humanity was the first crack in the foundation of his indoctrination. Then came the processing. He was moved to rear echelon collection points where he was fed hot food, often for the first time in weeks. He was deloused with DDT powder, given a shower, and issued clean, if ill-fitting clothing marked with PW. He was seen by medics who treated his wounds, frostbite or trench foot, with a professionalism he had not anticipated. The journey to the United States itself was another layer of surrealism. For many, it was their first time on a large ship. They were transported on Liberty ships, often housed in the same holds that had carried American troops and supplies to Europe. The conditions were crowded but safe. They were fed regularly, and for the first time in years, the constant threat of imminent violent death was gone. They sailed past the Statue of Liberty, a symbol they had only seen in magazines, and docked in ports bustling with a level of commercial activity that seemed impossible for a nation supposedly strained by a world war. From there they boarded trains, often comfortable passenger cars, not cattle trucks, and began a journey across a continent so vast and untouched by war it seemed to belong to another planet. Through the train windows they saw endless fields of corn, thriving cities, and civilians who seemed utterly untroubled by the conflict raging thousands of miles away. Every mile of track, every meal served, every calm interaction deepened the profound sense of cognitive dissonance. The America he was entering was not the one he had been taught to hate. It was something else entirely. While the German prisoners were grappling with their new reality, the American public and the military authorities were dealing with a challenge of their own: how to accommodate hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers on home soil. The general public's perception of the Germans was shaped by war bond posters, newsreels, and reports of atrocities like the Malmedy massacre. They were, in the popular imagination, the Krauts or the Nazis, a fanatical, jackbooted enemy. The arrival of massive numbers of POWs was met with a mixture of curiosity, apprehension, and sometimes outright hostility. In towns near the camps, there were legitimate fears of mass escapes. Rumors spread about arrogant, defiant Nazi prisoners who had to be subdued by force. Some Americans, particularly those who had lost sons, brothers, or husbands in the fighting, were outraged at the seemingly comfortable conditions provided to the men who had killed their loved ones. Letters poured into newspapers and congressmen demanding to know why. German POWs were being coddled, while American boys were dying in muddy foxholes. The War Department understood this sentiment and walked a fine line. On one hand, they had to maintain security and placate a nervous public. On the other, they were bound by the Geneva Convention and the strategic need to ensure reciprocal treatment for American prisoners. They launched a quiet but effective public relations campaign, emphasizing the labor contribution of the prisoners and the importance of adhering to international law. Inside the camps, the American guards and administrators had a more nuanced view. They were not dealing with a monolithic entity of Nazis. They were managing individuals. The camp staff, often composed of soldiers not deemed fit for frontline combat or veterans rotated home, had to quickly learn to differentiate between the prisoners. They found that the POW population was a cross-section of German and Austrian society. There were ardent, unrepentant Nazis, often from the SS or Fallschirmjäger units, who remained defiant, organized secret Nazi cells within the camps, and sometimes intimidated or even murdered fellow prisoners they deemed disloyal. These black prisoners, as they were categorized, were a constant security concern and were often segregated into specific high-security camps like Alva, Oklahoma. Then there were the whites, the anti-Nazis. These were political dissidents, Austrians who resented the Anschluss, or men who had been forcibly conscripted from occupied territories like Poland or Alsace-Lorraine. They were often cooperative and eager to prove their opposition to the regime. The vast majority of prisoners, however, fell into a gray category. They were the ordinary soldiers, the farmers, factory workers, and students who had been conscripted into the Wehrmacht. They were not necessarily ideological Nazis, but they had fought for their country out of a sense of duty, patriotism, or simple self-preservation. Their primary concern was no longer fighting for the Führer. It was surviving their captivity and one day returning home. The American camp commanders' primary expectation was order. Their goal was to prevent escapes, riots, and internal violence. They quickly learned that the best way to do this was not through brutality, but through a system of predictable routines, meaningful work, and opportunities for recreation and education. A prisoner who was busy, well-fed, and had something to occupy his mind was far less likely to cause trouble. The camp authorities understood that providing access to libraries, sports, musical instruments, and educational classes was not an act of kindness, but a tool of effective camp management. This pragmatic approach, designed to maintain security with minimal manpower, was the very thing that created the resort-like atmosphere that so stunned the German arrivals. For Gefreiter Carl Schmidt, the rhythm of life at Camp Clinton settled into a routine that was both monotonous and profoundly strange. The action here was not the frantic chaos of combat, but the structured, predictable, and almost peaceful sequence of a day in captivity. His day began not with the scream of an artillery shell, but with the sound of a bugle call at 0600 hours. After a roll call, or appel, conducted with brisk American efficiency, came breakfast. He would line up in the mess hall, a large wooden building that smelled of coffee and bacon. The contrast with his last months in the field was jarring. There, a meal might be a chunk of hard bread, gnawed on while crouched in a frozen trench. Here, he was handed a tray laden with food he hadn't seen in years: scrambled eggs, pancakes, milk, and coffee with real sugar. The sheer abundance was a constant source of conversation and disbelief among the prisoners. After breakfast, the work details were assigned. Carl, having worked on a farm before the war, was assigned to a detail that picked cotton in the fields surrounding the camp. Each morning, he and hundreds of other prisoners would be loaded onto the back of U.S. Army trucks and driven out to the fields under the watchful eyes of a few armed guards. The work was hard, especially under the oppressive Mississippi sun, but it was not brutal. They were given regular water breaks, and the guards were often relaxed, content to sit in the shade as long as the work got done. The interactions with the local population were minimal but memorable. Local farmers, initially wary, came to rely on the prisoner labor to save their harvests. Carl saw American civilians, women, children, old men, and was struck by how their lives seemed utterly untouched by the global cataclysm he had just been a part of. They drove cars, they had full shops, they lived in a world of impossible peace and plenty. At the end of the workday, they were trucked back to camp. After the evening meal, their time was their own. This was perhaps the most surreal part of his existence. In the Wehrmacht, any free time was spent cleaning weapons, digging defenses, or simply trying to stay warm. Here, a universe of possibilities opened up. Camp Clinton had a library stocked with German language books, many of them secretly provided by U.S. intelligence as part of a re-education program, but also plenty of German classics. Karl, who had not read a novel in 5 years, found himself lost in the works of Goethe and Schiller. In the evenings, the camp came alive with activity. A theater group, formed by prisoners who had been actors in Berlin and Vienna, put on productions of classic German plays. An orchestra, using instruments provided by the YMCA, practiced symphonies by Beethoven and Mozart. The sounds of a string quartet would drift across the compound, a scene so civilized and absurdly out of place that it bordered on the fantastical. On the recreational fields, fierce soccer rivalries developed between barracks. Men who a few months earlier had been fighting and dying alongside each other now poured their energy into scoring goals. It was a release, a way to feel human and alive, to sweat and strive for something that didn't involve killing. At the canteen, Karl could spend his hard-earned scrip. The simple act of buying a pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes or a cold bottle of Coca-Cola was an exercise in freedom he had not known was possible as a prisoner. It gave him a tiny measure of control over his own life. Of course, it was still a prison. The barbed wire fences were always there. The guard towers were always manned. Letters from home were infrequent and heavily censored, a constant, painful reminder of the life he had lost. And there was the ever-present internal tension between the ardent Nazis and the rest of the prisoners. But even with these reminders of their captivity, the daily action for Karl and thousands like him was not one of suffering, but of structured, peaceful, and shockingly civilized existence. The American government's objective for the POW program was not merely to warehouse enemy soldiers until the war was over. A quiet, more ambitious plan was at work, an experiment in psychological warfare that would have unexpected and far-reaching consequences. This was the Special Projects Division of the Provost Marshal General's Office, a top-secret intellectual re-education program designed to turn the hearts and minds of German prisoners away from Nazism and towards democratic ideals. The program was subtle and multifaceted. It began with simple information control. While prisoners were allowed access to news, the camp newspapers, like Der Ruf, the Call, were carefully curated. They printed news from the front, but they framed it within a narrative of inevitable Allied victory and exposed the lies of Goebbels's propaganda machine. For the first time, prisoners read uncensored accounts of the Nazi regime's atrocities, the concentration camps, and the true state of the war. The key, however, was not overt propaganda which the prisoners would have immediately rejected. It was education. The Americans identified anti-Nazi intellectuals, professors, writers, and artists among the prisoner population, and gave them the resources to set up a parallel university system within the camps. Prisoners could take courses in American history, English, democratic theory, and civics. These classes were taught by their own countrymen, lending them an authenticity and credibility that American instructors never could have achieved. Libraries were stocked with thousands of books that had been banned and burned by the Nazis, works by Thomas Mann, Erich Maria Remarque, and Jack London. The prisoners, starved for intellectual stimulation, devoured them. The goal was to reintroduce them to the German humanistic traditions that Nazism had tried to destroy and to expose them to American democratic thought. The program also used film. Instead of crude propaganda, they showed documentaries by acclaimed directors like Frank Capra, including the Why We Fight series. Crucially, after the liberation of the concentration camps in 1 Mas 945, they showed uncensored footage from Buchenwald and Dachau. For many German soldiers, who had been insulated from the worst horrors of the regime or had dismissed them as enemy propaganda, these images were a profound and sickening shock. It was an undeniable, visual confrontation with the true nature of the system they had fought for. The screenings were often met with stunned silence, weeping, and visceral denial. But the seeds of doubt were planted deep. This intellectual rehabilitation was the most unexpected outcome of their captivity. Men who arrived as cogs in the Nazi war machine were given the tools to deconstruct the ideology that had led them there. They learned to think critically about nationalism, authority, and democracy. The camps, designed for confinement, became accidental incubators for the democratic leaders of post-war Germany. When the war ended, the most promising graduates of this secret school were identified. Men like Alfred Anders and Hans-Werner Richter, who had edited Der Ruf in American captivity, would return to Germany to become leading figures in its post-war literary and intellectual reconstruction. They, along with thousands of other re-educated prisoners, would form a crucial pro-American, pro-democratic bulwark in West Germany during the nascent Cold, or the American gamble that treating prisoners with dignity and exposing them to ideas could be more powerful than coercion, had paid off in ways no one could have fully anticipated. The prison camps had become classrooms, and the prisoners, their first students in the rebuilding of a nation. The psychological impact of this experience on the individual German soldier was immense and complex. It was a prolonged state of cognitive dissonance, the mental stress of holding two contradictory beliefs at the same time. The first belief was everything they had been taught. America was a corrupt, weak, and brutal enemy. The second was the undeniable reality of their daily lives. They were being treated humanely, fed well, and given opportunities for self-improvement. This clash of realities shattered the worldviews they had carried into captivity. For the truly fanatical Nazi, the experience was infuriating. They saw the good treatment as a sign of American weakness and decadence. They tried to maintain their ideological purity, holding secret meetings, singing forbidden songs, and viewing their cooperative countrymen with contempt. For them, the camp was just another battlefield, and they were engaged in a struggle to maintain their ideological honor. But for the vast majority, the gray soldiers like Carl Schmitt, the effect was one of profound disorientation and eventually, transformation. The first stage was often suspicion. They couldn't believe their good fortune was genuine. They expected the kind treatment to be a trick, a prelude to some terrible fate. But as weeks turned into months and the routine of decent food, fair work, and free evenings continued, suspicion gave way to a grudging acceptance, and finally to a quiet sense of awe. The sheer, overwhelming evidence of American prosperity was a powerful form of propaganda in itself. It wasn't delivered in a lecture, it was experienced daily. The quality of the food, the number of cars on the roads, the well-stocked canteens, the casual way American guards consumed goods that would be unimaginable luxuries back home. All of it painted a picture of a nation with inexhaustible resources. This directly contradicted Goebbels' narrative of a country on the verge of economic collapse. The prisoners came to a simple, powerful conclusion. A system that could wage a global war and simultaneously provide such a high standard of living, even for its captured enemies, must be incredibly powerful and successful. This realization led to a deep questioning of everything they had fought for. If the Americans weren't the monsters they were told, and if the German cause was not as righteous or successful as they believed, what had the last 5 years of suffering been for? The news of the Holocaust, confirmed by the camp films, added a layer of deep collective shame. It forced them to confront the moral bankruptcy of the regime they had served, whether willingly or not. The effect was a slow, quiet erosion of their former identity. The rigid military discipline of the Wehrmacht was replaced by the more relaxed, individualistic camp life. Their identity as soldiers in a grand national crusade dissolved, replaced by a focus on personal survival, learning a new skill, or simply dreaming of returning to their families. In a very real sense, the American POW camps did more than just remove German soldiers from the battlefield. They deprogrammed them. They dismantled the mental and ideological framework of the German Lanzer and, in its place, left a vacuum that, for many, would be filled with the democratic ideas they were exposed to in their strange, comfortable captivity. The psychological war had been won not with bullets but with bread, books, and baseball. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the mission of the POW camps shifted from confinement to repatriation, but the process was slow. It would take until 1947 for the last German prisoners to be sent home from the United States. They returned to a country that was physically and morally shattered. Their homes were rubble, their families were scattered, and their nation was a pariah, divided and occupied by the very powers they had been fighting. These returning prisoners, however, were different. They carried with them not just their meager personal belongings, but an experience that few of their countrymen could comprehend. They had seen America. Not the caricature from propaganda posters, but the real thing. A vast, wealthy, powerful, and, in their experience, fundamentally decent nation. They had learned English. They had been exposed to democratic principles. They understood American culture in a way no other group of Germans did. This group of nearly 400,000 men became an invaluable and unforeseen asset for the United States in the post-war era. As the Iron Curtain descended across Europe, the U.S. strategy shifted from defeating Germany to rebuilding it as a bulwark against Soviet expansion. The Marshall Plan poured billions of dollars into reconstructing West Germany, but money alone could not build a democracy. It required a population willing to embrace it. The returned POWs became crucial bridge figures. In their communities, they could counter the anti-American sentiment that lingered. They could speak with authority when they said that the Americans were not the monsters of Nazi propaganda. They had first-hand evidence. Their personal stories, told in pubs, at family tables, and in town squares, helped to slowly reshape German perceptions of their former enemy, and now occupier. Many of these men went on to become leaders in the new Federal Republic of Germany. They became politicians, business owners, academics, and civil servants. Their unique experience in the U.S. gave them a perspective that was instrumental in anchoring West Germany firmly in the Western Alliance. They understood the American mindset and could work effectively with American authorities during the Reconstruction and the Cold War. The story of the German POWs in America is a remarkable chapter in the history of the Second World War. It stands in stark contrast to the brutal fate of prisoners on the Eastern Front, where millions perished in Soviet gulags. The American program, born of pragmatism and a commitment to the rule of law, had an impact far beyond its original intent. It not only fulfilled its strategic goal of ensuring better treatment for Allied prisoners, but also inadvertently created a generation of German men who would help heal the wounds of war and forge one of the most enduring and important alliances of the 20th century. For the individual soldier, like Gefreiter Karl Schmidt, the return home was the final, jarring chapter of his odyssey. He left a land of plenty to return to a land of scarcity. He left a place of order to return to a place of chaos. But he also carried back a seed of hope, a belief that a different future was possible, a future he had glimpsed in the most unlikely of places. Behind the barbed wire of a Mississippi prison camp that, to his starved and weary eyes, had looked almost like a vacation resort,